I'm Iain and welcome back to the Northland Workshop. We're going to start a series on building pieces of furniture for a bedroom. And they're all going to go in this same guest room, so the pieces need to be tied together in style. Two of these pieces I've already built. This 3-drawer nightstand and a big pine wardrobe that is just off camera over there. So I figured before we jump into the chest of drawers build, it would be a good idea to revisit these classic programs and see what it took to build the nightstand and the wardrobe. So up first, the 3-drawer nightstand. Now this is a very nice nightstand because it has 3 wood dovetailed drawers, a big one and 2 smaller ones. It has a solid wood top with breadboard ends. The breadboard ends are tongue and groove on the end, so that way the field of the table can expand and contract with changes in humidity. Right now, because it's winter time and the heat is on, it's actually pulled back in about 1/16 of an inch from where it normally is. And it's just the right height to go beside a bed. The way this room is set up, the thing most people see first on this nightstand isn't the front with the 3 drawers, it's actually this side. And because of that, both sides have raised panels to them. So between the raised panels, the top with the breadboard ends, the dovetailed drawers, and the tapered legs, there's a lot going on in this piece all at one time, and that makes it a very fun build. So I hope you enjoy this classic episode of the Northland Workshop as much as I did building this project. I want to start out this project by gluing up the various boards that'll make up the nightstand top. And if you see, I have a whole bunch of boards laid out here in an order that I think makes the grain look pretty nice and should blend together pretty well once it's stained and polyurethane. The issue I have with these boards is that the gaps in between the various glue surfaces are going to make for a very weak joint. A couple passes over the jointer should be all that's needed to get these boards ready for glue up. I'm going ahead and cutting some slots for some number 20 biscuits that will help reinforce the top and aid in alignment while we clamp it up. Now it's time for the first glue up of the project, and it can be a little stressful when the glue bottle comes out because suddenly you're on the clock. You have to get all these things glued and assembled before the glue starts to set up. But if you take your time, you lay out the clamps in advance, do a dry run to make sure you have enough clamps, and then just lay out all the pieces in the right order, it shouldn't be too bad. With glue on the edge and in the biscuit slot, I just put a number 20 biscuit in each slot. Now I just want to apply enough pressure to the clamps to get a nice even bead of squeeze out all the way along the joint. I'm ready to start working on the legs of the nightstand, and if you look, it's 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches thick. It's made up of 2 3/4 inch thick boards glued together, and now what I need to do is trim them to length and even up the ends. First thing I want to do is square up one end with the radial arm saw, and then push the freshly cut end all the way down to the stop block I have here and cut the other end. That'll make 4 legs that are exactly the same length, and therefore the nightstand should not rock when it's set on the ground. I'm ready to start cutting the dados and notches in the legs to receive the dust frames that are going to separate one drawer from another and give the drawer something to write on. And to do that, I've laid out the locations for the different dados, and I've set up the stacked dado head in my radial arm saw to be the correct thickness for a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, which is what the dust frames will be made out of. Now all I have to do is just cut them out. The front legs have a stop dado. Because of that, I can't cut it on the radial arm saw, so I've turned to the drill press and a 5/8 diameter Forstner bit. I'll cut out as much material with the Forstner bit as I can, and then clean it up with a good sharp chisel back at the bench. And now it just takes some quality time with a hammer and chisel to clean up the rest of the material in these notches. I'm using the benchtop mortiser to make the mortises in the legs that will receive the rails for the side panels. And you can do this a bunch of different ways. You can use the drill press to drill out the bulk of the material and a chisel to square it up. But if you happen to find a good deal on a benchtop mortiser, it really makes short work of doing mortises. Each leg is going to get tapered from 1.5 inches down to 7/8 of an inch at the bottom on both inside faces. So it'll be straight on the outside edge, but both this side and this side will taper in. And because it's such a short, steep taper, the tapering jig on the table saw really wouldn't do it. So I have another way. What I've done is lined up the blade of the radial arm saw with the start of the taper, and then the end of the taper lines up with the curve that the blade makes in the table. Now all I have to do is screw this piece of wood down to the table to act as a secondary fence. And now, for each leg, I just butt it up against there, hold it in place, and make the cut. Each leg has 2 mortises, one for the bottom rail and one for the top rail. In between the 2 rails, it's going to have a raised panel, so it needs a groove to connect the 2 into which the edge of the panel can sit. And to make a stopped groove, the best thing I know of is the router table. And here I've got a 1/4 inch straight cutting bit set 3/8 of an inch above the table, and all I'll do to make the groove is to turn the router on, set it down over the mortise, push it through until I get to the other mortise, and pick it back up. Let's see how it goes. I'm in the process of cutting the tenons on the ends of the rails for the sides of the nightstand, and all I'm doing to cut them is I've set up a stop block on my rip fence so that way I get them exactly 3/4 of an inch wide, and I'm just nibbling them away with the combination blade. Each side of the nightstand needs a raised panel, and to make the raised panel I've set up the radial arm saw with the panel raising jig, which is nothing more than a secondary table with a slot that's horizontal in the fence with the blade sticking through at a 10-degree angle. By pushing the wood through with the blade set at an angle, I get a perfectly raised panel every time. With a thin layer of glue on the tenon and down in the mortise, we can go ahead and start assembling the first side of the nightstand. Now I can go ahead and put a panel in, making sure not to put any glue in the grooves. I want this panel to float. That way it can expand and contract with changes in humidity without the risk of it splitting apart. There. Now we can go ahead, put it in the clamps. And just start to snug it down. I'm putting the finishing touches today on the dust frames for the drawers. All these are 4 pieces of 3/4 inch thick birch plywood that have a tongue and a groove cut in them to give me a fast and convenient way to fasten them together. These will be what the drawers ride on in the nightstand, and they're also what will keep the sides connected together. I don't have enough clamps to clamp each one of these things up for the entire length it would take to dry. So what I'm doing instead is using some 5/8 brads just to nail the little stub tenons in until the glue dries. Now I can set this one off to dry. I've been in the process of taking this 2-inch wide piece of pine and turning it into a breadboard end for the nightstand. And the way I did that was to route a groove in one edge, 3/8 of an inch wide, 1 inch deep. And now I've traced out a round object on the corners so I can round them over, because it's a lot easier to round them over on the belt sander now than it is to try and do it by hand once it's attached to the nightstand. I'm drilling a series of holes in the underside of the breadboard edge that I can use to dowel it all together. If we pull the breadboard end off, you see we have holes in the tongue. Now what I want to do to the 2 end ones is actually twist the drill bit back and forth as I drill through to elongate the hole, so that way if the panel needs to expand and contract, it doesn't crack right where this dowel is. And I'll do the same thing over here. Now with the holes drilled, what I want to do is glue the center 3 inches or so of this tongue. What that'll do is lock the breadboard end in place, but again, if it needs to expand and contract along its width, it can. I'm in the process of assembling the nightstand, and right now what I'm doing is putting glue in each of the notches that will receive a dust frame. And now, just sliding the dust frame down into its slot. And to hold it there while the glue sets up, I'm just going to toenail in 1 1/4 inch brad into each one. That's enough to hold it until the glue dries. it's time to attach the drawer front to a drawer side. These are two test pieces that I tried out to make sure the jointery was going to work okay. And the joint I chose is called a half-blind dovetail joint. These are the tails, and these are the pins. The pins go on the drawer front, the tails go on the drawer side. And when you put those two together with a little bit of glue, you get a joint that you're never going to be able to pull the front of this drawer off this side because of the wedge shape. Now, it might look kind of complicated to make a joint like this, but it's really not. All you need is an inexpensive dovetail jig and a router with a collar and a dovetailing bit. The key to using the dovetail jig is to remember inside out. This is the inside of the drawer front, it's facing out. This is the inside of the drawer side, it's facing out. Now I can go ahead and use the router to trace along this metal comb, and with the special dovetailing bit and the collar, I'll get a perfect dovetail joint every time. The back of each drawer attaches to the drawer side with a simple dado joint. To cut that dado, I've set up the radial arm saw with two stop blocks. By first butting the side of the drawer up against the first stop block and making a cut, then progressing it over to the second stop block, I can nibble away the material, leaving me the perfectly sized dado joint in each side. The first step in assembling a drawer is to sand all the inside edges. It's a lot easier to do that with the drawer all apart than once it's all put together. The best way to drive home one of the dovetail joints is with a block of wood and a hammer. That way, it automatically lines the pins up flush with the edge of the tails. And then, you just have to clean up the excess glue that squeezes out. A couple well-placed brads in the back take the place of a clamp, so I don't have to tie up a clamp for every drawer. And to complete the drawer, you just slide in a 1/4-inch plywood bottom. Before we staple that in place, we're just going to check the drawer for square. First drawer. While the jury is still out on what type of knobs we're going to put on the nightstand, I can drill a pilot hole for it now, because that way any layout marks that I put on here will be sanded off when I do the final sanding. Speaking of the final sanding, I think it's ready to be sanded one last time and then polyurethaned. So, I guess that's that for this project.